There are deaths, Dr. Watson, that arrive with violence, and others that come softly, leaving behind no mark upon the body, yet carving deep wounds upon the soul of those left to remember. It was upon such a morning that a widow climbed the steps of Baker Street. Her grief carried not in sobs, but in the rigid dignity of a woman determined to be believed. Her husband, she told us, had died without injury, without poison, without sound, save for a single cry that no one heard. He was frightened to death, she whispered, as though fear itself might still be listening. Holmes did not question her emotion. Instead, he observed the silence that followed her words, for silence, he often said, is where truth rehearses its confession. Mrs. Blackthorne stood before us as though carved from restraint itself, her mourning garments immaculate, her sorrow disciplined into a posture of quiet endurance. I observed, Holmes murmured later, that true grief does not seek attention, it merely survives beneath it. She did not wring her hands, nor did she weep. Instead, she clasped her gloves with such force that the leather creased beneath her fingers. "My husband feared something long before it claimed him," she said, her voice steady until the final word betrayed a tremor she could not suppress. Watson, ever sensitive to the human heart, leaned forward, not to interrogate, but to listen. Holmes, by contrast, reclined slightly, his gaze fixed not upon her face, but upon the spaces between her sentences. Fear, Holmes would later remark, leaves patterns as distinctive as fingerprints, if one knows where to look. Blackthorn Lane, she explained, had once been a place of comfort, until familiarity itself began to feel like a watchful presence. Even the walls, she claimed, had learned to listen. It was then that Holmes rose at last, his movements unhurried, as though the investigation had already begun the moment she crossed the threshold. The journey to Blackthorn Lane unfolded beneath a sky the color of old pewter, London streets retreating into mist as though reluctant to remember what waited at their end. Mrs. Blackthorne spoke little as we rode, her gaze fixed upon the passing buildings, each familiar sight seeming to draw her further inward. Holmes, opposite her, regarded the city as a reader studies margins, alert to what lingers unnoticed beyond the printed line. Watson, meanwhile, felt the subtle weight of anticipation settle in his chest, for places marked by grief rarely greet the living kindly. Blackthorn Lane revealed itself at last, a narrow throat of brick and shadow, where even the fog seemed reluctant to disperse. The houses stood in disciplined rows, respectable and reserved, yet bearing the unmistakable fatigue of secrets long kept. Mrs. Blackthorne's home lay midway down the lane, its windows dark despite the hour, as though morning had closed its eyes. She paused upon the threshold, her gloved hand hovering near the door, as though the act of entry required a courage she had not yet named. Holmes noted the hesitation, not as weakness, but as evidence. Fear, after all, remembers places better than people. Within, the house greeted us with a chill that had nothing to do with the season. Every sound seemed amplified, the closing of the door, the settling of coats, the distant creak of timbers adjusting to our intrusion. Watson became acutely aware of the silence between sounds, that unnatural pause wherein the imagination eagerly supplies its own horrors. Holmes removed his gloves deliberately, as though preparing to converse not with the living, but with the house itself. "Nothing here shouts," Holmes observed softly, "and that, Mrs. Blackthorne, is precisely what troubles me." Above us, unseen and unspoken, the bedroom where Arthur Blackthorne had breathed his last awaited its reckoning. The staircase ascended with a solemn patience, each step worn smooth by years of ordinary living now rendered extraordinary by death. Mrs. Blackthorne climbed first, her hand brushing the banister as though drawing strength from its familiarity. Holmes followed without haste, his eyes measuring distances, angles, and absences invisible to the untrained gaze. Watson lingered a moment behind, struck by the sensation that the house itself was holding its breath. At the landing, a single door awaited us, closed, unadorned, and unremarkable in every way save one. It had been locked from the inside. No signs of force disturbed the frame, the wood bore neither scratch nor splinter, offering no assistance to suspicion. "It was exactly so when they found him," Mrs. Blackthorne said, her voice barely disturbing the air. Holmes inclined his head, not in sympathy, but in acknowledgment of a fact carefully preserved. The key, she explained, had been discovered upon the inside, resting obediently in the lock. Watson felt a chill settle deeper, for locked rooms offer comfort only when one trusts the boundaries of reason. Holmes knelt, examining the threshold, where dust lay undisturbed. No hurried footstep had crossed it. Death, it appeared, had been courteous enough to leave no mess. Within the chamber, time itself seemed to have paused in respectful observance. The bed stood neatly made, the covers unrumpled, denying any struggle or restless sleep. Arthur Blackthorne had been found seated upright, as though awaiting an answer that never came. No lamp had been overturned, no window stood open to invite intruders or explanations. Holmes moved slowly, as one does in sacred spaces, aware that noise alone might disturb a delicate truth. "Madam," he said at last, "your husband did not die suddenly, he died deliberately frightened." The room offered no protest, yet in its silence, it agreed. Holmes began not with the body, but with the life that had preceded it, for death, he often said, is merely the final punctuation of a much longer sentence. "Tell me how your husband passed his evenings," Holmes asked, his tone gentle, almost conversational. Mrs. Blackthorne hesitated, as though uncertain which memories were safe to release. "He kept his habits," she replied at last. "Always the same. Supper at 7. Reading by 8. Bed precisely at 10. Holmes's eyes lifted briefly at the word precisely. Routine, Holmes knew, is the scaffolding upon which the mind learns comfort and vulnerability. Watson noted the bookshelf, its volumes arranged with fastidious care, none disturbed. "He disliked disorder," Mrs. Blackthorne continued. "It unsettled him." Holmes crossed to the mantel, where a huge clock rested, its ticking steady and insistent. "And yet," Holmes murmured, "something disrupted that order." She nodded faintly. "He began waking in the night. Listening." "Listening," Holmes observed, "is the first obedience fear demands." "At first," she said, "it was nothing more than a sound. Soft, irregular, easily dismissed. But repetition, like persuasion, improves its craft with time." Arthur Blackthorne began keeping notes, small observations written in careful hand. Dates. Hours. Silences measured as carefully as noise. Watson felt a quiet unease, for he recognized the markings of a man attempting to reason with dread. Holmes, however, appeared almost satisfied, for fear, when documented, reveals its architecture. "Madam," Holmes said gently, "your husband was not afraid of chaos. He was afraid of expectation. And expectation, once planted, rarely arrives alone." The first sound, Mrs. Blackthorne explained, was so slight it scarcely deserved the name, more a suggestion than a disturbance. A faint tap, irregular in rhythm, arriving always after the house had surrendered to sleep. Arthur dismissed it at first, attributing the intrusion to pipes, wind, or the common mischief of old houses. Holmes listened with visible interest, for dismissal is often fear's preferred disguise. The sound returned the following night, unchanged, unhurried, unmistakably intentional. Watson felt the quiet repetition tighten something behind his ribs. "Did it vary?" Holmes asked softly. "No," she replied. "That was what frightened him most." Sameness, Holmes reflected, teaches expectation faster than threat ever could. Arthur began waiting for the sound, counting the moments until its arrival. Silence, once neutral, became anticipatory. When the sound did not come, the absence proved worse than its presence. For now, the house had taught him to listen. Holmes traced a finger lightly along the wall, as though following the memory of sound itself. "Fear," he said, "is most obedient when it believes it has discovered the pattern on its own." Arthur ceased sleeping soundly. Rest became a shallow arrangement, easily broken. His nights grew longer, not by hours, but by vigilance. Watson recognized the signs, a mind at war with expectation. Holmes, however, saw something more deliberate. The sound was not a warning, it was a lesson. It was only after the sounds were understood that Holmes inquired about the people. "Who else resided in the house?" he asked, his voice casual, his intent precise. Mrs. Blackthorne hesitated, just long enough for the question to matter. "Only Miss Hale," she said at last. "Our former governess." "Former," Holmes repeated softly. Miss Prudence Hale, she explained, had remained in their service long after the children were grown. Not out of necessity, but out of loyalty. Or so it appeared. She kept the house in order, the routines intact, the rhythms unbroken. A presence so constant it became invisible. Holmes inclined his head slightly, as though greeting a thought rather than a person. Discipline, he murmured, is a form of devotion. Watson sensed the subtle shift, the way the air itself seemed to reorganize around a new idea. Miss Hale, it seemed, had always known the house's timings. The sounds, the silences, the patterns of movement. She knew when the house slept. Mrs. Blackthorne spoke of her kindly, without affection and without complaint. That, Holmes noted, is often how influence hides best. Not in passion, but in permanence. It was in the study that we discovered the letters, folded precisely, their edges crisp as if to resist the passage of time. Holmes lifted the topmost note with care, observing the handwriting, the slope of each letter betraying hope, or perhaps longing restrained. Watson, peering over his shoulder, felt the quiet pulse of intimacy preserved within these small sheets of paper. "My dearest Arthur," one began, "I fear the nights have grown too long, the shadows too patient." The words were simple, yet deliberate, capturing love and trepidation in equal measure. Holmes's finger traced the indentation of repeated words, the cadence of writing as revealing as any spoken confession. Arthur's replies, once spirited and affectionate, had grown clipped, measured, almost fearful in tone. Each correspondence bore witness not to passion alone, but to something steadily eroding the warmth between them. Watson noticed the subtle shift in Mrs. Blackthorne's expression as she read aloud, her grief touching each syllable. Holmes, ever attentive to absence, remarked quietly, "Fear need not strike the body when it can corrode the heart instead." Miss Prudence Hale's presence in these rituals became apparent only when traced through the margins. Tidy ink smudges, folded corners, ink stains perfectly aligned with her hand. Her influence was subtle, almost invisible, yet relentless. She preserved routines, encouraged dependence, and masked resentment as propriety. Arthur's nightly observations were copied carefully, catalogued as though for future scrutiny. It was here, in the intersection of affection and order, that fear found fertile ground. Watson whispered, "He loved her once. Deeply, yet terror seems to have supplanted tenderness." Holmes did not answer immediately, for observation often precedes commentary in his method. Every habitual time, every ritual of care, became a scaffold upon which anxiety could be built. Even the smallest deviations, the misaligned chair, a slightly open window, would be magnified in his mind, lessons delivered by silence. It was then that Holmes realized the careful orchestration. No hasty gestures, no overt threats, only patience, precision, and the quiet hand of influence. In these letters, in these notes, and in the unnoticed acts of domestic discipline, fear had learned to speak its language fluently. Holmes stood in stillness, not as a man awaiting revelation, but as one listening for the shape of intention itself, for fear, when repeated, becomes design. "Terror," he said quietly, "rarely improvises, Watson, it rehearses." The room bore no chaos, only order arranged with unnatural care. Even fear, it seemed, had learned discipline. Mrs. Blackthorne watched us not with suspicion, but with a reverence reserved for those she believed might restore meaning to loss. Her grief was not loud, it was structured, measured, and deeply rehearsed. Holmes, however, listened not to her sorrow, but to the architecture surrounding it. Fear, he knew, leaves no fingerprints, only patterns. Patterns form when repetition replaces accident. And repetition, when guided, becomes orchestration. Watson felt it then, the shift from mystery to method. The house itself had become an instrument. Each corridor a conduit, each room a chamber of influence. No scream had been required, only suggestion. No violence, only persuasion. No force, only pressure. Fear, when cultivated, becomes obedience. And obedience, when prolonged, becomes surrender. Holmes exhaled slowly, as one who had found not a culprit, but a system. "We are no longer searching for a murderer, Watson," he said softly, "but for the engineer of a mind. Influence, Watson, is rarely loud. It enters quietly, wearing the garments of necessity and the voice of care. It does not command, it convinces. And in convincing, it reshapes the will without ever touching the body. Miss Prudence Hale had not haunted the house. She had organized it. Her presence was not felt as intrusion, but as structure. Structure, when accepted, becomes authority. Authority, when trusted, becomes submission. She had taught him not to fear death, but to fear disorder. Disorder became the enemy. Silence became instruction. Routine became refuge. And refuge became dependence. Holmes did not seek her footsteps, he traced her habits. For habits reveal more than confessions. Fear had been taught, not discovered. And terror had been trained, not triggered. The mind had been prepared long before the body surrendered. What frightened Mr. Blackthorne was not a moment, it was a method. The widow had lost a husband. But the house had lost its architect of fear. Fear, Watson, is not an event. It is a condition cultivated over time. It is grown patiently, like ivy upon stone. Each small suggestion becomes a root. Each repetition becomes a vine. Until the structure can no longer breathe. Mr. Blackthorne did not fear a thing, he feared a condition. His mind had been taught to expect dread. Anticipation became his tormentor. Expectation became his executioner. No poison touched his blood. No blade touched his skin. No hand touched his body. But a mind, once shaped, needs no violence to collapse. Holmes spoke softly, as one explaining a quiet law of nature. The brain, he said, can be trained to betray the heart. And the heart will follow. Watson felt not horror, but sorrow. For the crime was not cruelty, it was design. Not rage, but method. Not hatred, but architecture. Holmes requested Miss Hale's presence as though inviting her to tea. She entered without hesitation. Her composure was immaculate. Holmes did not greet her with accusation. He asked instead about routine. At what hour Mr. Blackthorne retired? At what hour the lights were extinguished? At what hour the corridor was inspected? The answers came quickly. Too quickly. Holmes crossed the room slowly. He stopped near the writing desk. Order, he said softly, is a comfort, is it not? Miss Hale agreed. And disorder? Holmes continued. Unsettling, she replied. Holmes allowed silence to expand. Mr. Blackthorne was taught to fear disorder. Miss Hale did not interrupt. You did not frighten him, Holmes concluded quietly. You educated him. Holmes did not raise his voice. He simply began to recount the pattern. The nightly inspections. The careful corrections. The reminders about proper arrangement. The warnings about disorder. Order preserves stability, Holmes quoted evenly. You told him that often. She did not deny it. She corrected his phrasing. It was guidance, she said. Guidance, Holmes repeated. Until guidance became dependence. For the first time, she blinked rapidly. You removed unpredictability from his life. You made uncertainty unbearable. Miss Hale's shoulders stiffened. I protected him, she replied. Holmes inclined his head. But you also taught him that he could not endure the world without you. Miss Hale's composure did not shatter. You misunderstand influence, she said carefully. I gave him stability. Holmes did not contradict her. You gave him certainty, he replied. Certainty in a world that frightened him. Miss Hale's breath faltered, just once. He was delicate, she insisted. Delicacy, Holmes said softly, requires resilience, not insulation. Eleanor looked between them. You told him he could not endure disorder. Miss Hale's jaw tightened. I protected him from distress. You removed his opportunity to overcome it. Silence filled the room. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair. Did he fear the world? She asked quietly. Or did he fear failing you? Miss Hale blinked rapidly. For the first time, uncertainty showed. Holmes spoke gently. Dependence feels like devotion, until it becomes confinement. Miss Hale did not answer immediately. The silence was no longer defensive. I gave him purpose, she said at last. Holmes inclined his head. And he gave you importance, Holmes replied. Miss Hale's fingers loosened. He needed structure, she insisted, but the force had left the word. Structure, Holmes said, is meant to support growth, not replace it. Miss Hale looked toward Eleanor for the first time. The look was not hostile. I never wished him harm, she said quietly. No, Holmes agreed. But you taught him he could not endure without you. The words landed softly. For the first time, she did not correct him. You loved him, Eleanor said. Miss Hale's composure gave way, not to tears, but to honesty. Yes, she whispered. No one spoke for several moments. The confession had not been loud. It had been human. Eleanor remained standing. Grief had shifted. I entrusted you with his strength, she said quietly. Miss Hale did not look away. I believed I was preserving it. Holmes stepped back slightly. This was no longer his confrontation. Eleanor's hands trembled once. He feared disappointing you, Eleanor said. Miss Hale inhaled slowly. I required excellence. He required permission to fail. The truth did not accuse. Watson felt the air change. Authority had dissolved into accountability. Holmes spoke at last. Control, he said evenly, is often born from fear of loss. And fear, he added softly, rarely protects what it seeks to preserve. The hour had grown late. Holmes retrieved his gloves from the desk. No formal verdict had been delivered. None was required. Eleanor inclined her head to Holmes. Thank you, she said softly. Holmes bowed slightly. The truth, he replied, is often gentler than illusion. Watson offered Eleanor a warm, steady look. Miss Hale remained seated. Authority had left her without ceremony. Not defeated. Holmes and Watson stepped into the corridor. The house felt different. Not lighter, but honest. Outside, the night air was cool. Watson broke the silence. Do you believe she meant harm? Holmes answered without hesitation. Intent, he said quietly, does not absolve consequence. There are crimes of passion, and there are crimes of design. The former strike swiftly, loud and visible. The latter unfold quietly, arranged with care, justified with love. In that house, no blade was drawn, no poison poured, no hand raised in anger, and yet a man learned to fear the very world that shaped him. We often mistake control for protection, and devotion for necessity. But when love removes the freedom to endure, it becomes something else entirely. Miss Hale believed she was preserving strength. In truth, she preserved dependence. Mrs. Blackthorne sought justice. What she found instead was clarity. Holmes once remarked that intent does not absolve consequence. I believe he meant something more. That the most dangerous architecture is not built of brick or stone, but of fear carefully repeated, until it feels like safety. And when such architecture collapses, it leaves no rubble, only silence. A silence in which truth must learn to stand on its own.